The Tokyo 2020 Olympics closed Sunday evening with a muted downside ceremony that echoed the empty cheerless stadiums where the more than 11,000 athletes competed under unprecedented circumstances. Held amid the COVID-19 pandemic, Olympics organisers seem to have prevented the global sporting event from turning into a super spreader affair. But the virus still affected every aspect of the Games, delaying it for a year, compromising the scale of its events and stripping it of fanfare and festivity. It was an Olympics like no other, and we discuss what legacy it's going to leave. For this, we are joined by Ben DOOLEY, Japan correspondent at the New York Times, and BULLEY, senior sports reporter at the Korea JoongAng Daily. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. And well, it was a crazy 2 weeks in Tokyo as the Olympics were held, but it's finally come to a close as of Sunday evening. And well, Ben, after years of preparation and months of contentious debate over whether it should take place or not, the Olympics closing ceremony, it took place at 8 p.m. Sunday, again in a very limited capacity. And of course, athletes are now having to leave the city within the 48 hours of the very last event. So what's it been like being in Tokyo for the past 2 weeks? And how do you feel now that it's all over?
It's been a strange experience, honestly. I've been shuttled back and forth from event to event, separated from the people of the city. It's like we've been in a bubble this entire time, and it's sort of strange to see people watching from the outside wanting to get in and not being able to be in these stadiums and on the fields of play without any spectators. It's been a very strange event.
And Jim, while there were, of course, a lot of concerns before the Olympics even took place over the safety of the Games and how it's going to be held, the logistics because of the coronavirus pandemic. And well, a few days ago, International Olympic Committee President Thomas Bach praised the Tokyo Olympic organisers, and he said it's the best ever prepared Olympic Games, and that the Commission had full confidence in the local authorities and their response to COVID-related concerns. And well, he also said there'd been a great Olympic soul throughout the event, unlike what he had feared. So, well, did you feel any of this? What was it like for you covering the Olympics this year as compared to previous ones?
I think that Bach is right, at least as far as the Olympic soul is concerned. I think a lot of us didn't expect this Olympics to work like an Olympics, generally works. Obviously, it wasn't perfect, and there have been COVID infections, and whether it was a good idea to hold an international sporting event during a major international health crisis is as much a question now as it was before the Games. But it is true that when it came down to the Olympics, there was that Olympic spirit, there was that Olympic soul, and for 2 weeks, more than 2 weeks, the sport was the main story, not the virus. And I think a lot of us didn't expect that going into it. In terms of covering it, obviously the last Olympics we did was Pyeongchang, which was right here on our doorstep, and we were there, and we were in the atmosphere, and all the people from all around the world kind of visiting us. So it's very difficult to compare. Obviously, we lose out on that atmosphere element, the emotional element. And my team did the entire Olympics, from an office in Seoul with a whole bunch of TV screens and laptop screens. So we really missed out on that side of it. I think honestly that they're incomparable, but that doesn't mean that this Olympics wasn't a success in its own way.
Right, and lots of successes and achievements to celebrate the Tokyo Olympics. And well, Ben, in the year that led up to the Olympics, of course, there was an ongoing debate over whether it should happen or not amid this pandemic. And much of the Japanese population, before it started, seemed to be rather against the idea. But would you say that that's perhaps changed over the course of the Olympics? And Thomas Bach, he said that the anti-COVID measures and the Commission's mission of keeping the Olympic athletes and the population separated seems to have worked. Do you think most of the Japanese population would agree with that?
To your first question, absolutely, the mood has shifted. Before the Games, 80% of the population here was against them. They wanted them to be canceled or delayed for another year. As they've watched the athletes perform, as Japan's medal count has gone up, people have become much more enthusiastic about what's been going on here. I think in some of the most recent polls, you see over 50% of the people who are being polled are happy that the Games took place. But it's important to realize that they're separating the performance of the athletes from the games as an institution. There's still a lot of dissatisfaction with how the government handled the games. People feel that they didn't pay attention to quite reasonable concerns about public health. And there's also a lot of frustration and anger, I think, at the IOC itself, because it feels like an unaccountable organization in some ways. You had people who represent the Olympics saying before the games that it didn't really matter what the Japanese people thought the games would go on regardless. And I think there's quite amount of reasonable frustration about that still. As far as the protocols, they seem to have been successful. I think that 19 of the participants ultimately weren't able to compete because they tested positive for COVID. There were very few cases of COVID within the Olympic bubble. But at the same time, there have been concerns among experts that holding the Olympics during the pandemic like this led to a sense of, it encouraged people to not take perhaps the pandemic as seriously as they might have otherwise done, because, in the city, there are all these people who are going from event to event. They're celebrating what's supposed to be this joyous occasion. And I think it took people off their guard to a certain extent. People, if you walk around Tokyo, maybe not today because it's raining, but say yesterday, people were out, they were celebrating, people were in the streets around the stadium, hoping to get a glimpse of, something related to the games. So there is a sense that perhaps the Olympics, maybe not directly, but indirectly, have contributed to the problems Tokyo is seeing today, where we have levels of infection at the highest rates they've been since the start of the pandemic.
And well, of course, Olympics officials and local authorities, they've denied that there's a direct link between the Olympics, the Games, and the surge in local transmission cases. Then what appears to have contributed to the continued surge of local transmissions? That's to you, Ben.
Yes, so I think it's just basically that people here are tired of the pandemic. They've spent a year, Tokyo hasn't experienced the kinds of lockdowns that other countries have, but there have been restrictions on people's behavior. You have restaurants and bars closing at 8 p.m. People are being asked to work from home, being told not to travel. And there was a real sense of danger in the beginning of the pandemic that kept people home. But as people have gotten used to the idea of the virus and gotten tired of staying home and limiting their activities, they've been going out. And naturally, when you have a virus that is transmitted through social interactions, people being close together, the more they go out, the more the virus will be transmitted. That's especially the case as we've seen the Delta variant appear here in Japan. So that's a big part of it. As I said, I think that the Olympics kind of encourage people to let their guard down to some extent. And that's also contributed to the problems that we're seeing here today.
Well, Jim, it seems that the athletes, they had to stay on alert all throughout the games, before the games, during the games. The COVID-19 protocols, it was affecting every part of their preparation, with all the checkups, the socially distanced training, and of course, even while they were performing or competing, there was the lack of cheering and fanfare. Do you think all of this really affected their performance and their morale?
Yeah, absolutely. The COVID protocols affect athletes' performance, starting with the big one, delaying the games for a year. For an athlete who's spent years and years and years building themselves up to be in the tip-top perfect physical condition for this event, and for it to then be delayed by a year is obviously going to be devastating. Unavoidable, of course, but devastating for the athletes. And a lot of athletes, both Korean and international, have said that hugely affected their performance. The lack of fans is also obviously an issue, as is having to constantly be tested and be careful about what you're doing. That is going to affect an athlete's morale. Again, these were things that absolutely had to happen, but that doesn't mean they're not going to affect the sport. Athletes are driven, a lot of them, by the cheers, by the sound of the crowd, and performing in sort of this closed, silent bubble is going to affect people. Of course, the athletes worked very hard to help each other. I don't remember ever seeing an Olympics where you had so many athletes turning out to help their teammates in different sports, to support them. That was actually one of the big sort of highlights of this Olympic, I think, was seeing that camaraderie. But it is going to affect them. And then I think there's also just something we talk about less, is just the stress of competing while knowing that the entire world is watching to see if you slip up, is watching to see if you're the one that breaks the COVID rules, if you're the one that gets infected. You know, all of the athletes had that pressure, consciously or subconsciously, were aware that a misstep in Tokyo could have brought the whole event to a halt, rather than just, you know, affecting their own Olympics. And I think it's unavoidable that kind of atmosphere is definitely going to affect how athletes perform.
Of course, and there was a great amount of attention on the mental health of athletes as well in this year's Olympics, and well, hopefully that will be discussed more and more in the future. And well, Ben, for now in Tokyo, are the COVID infection numbers expected to rise in the coming weeks, and are medical facilities and medical workers sufficiently prepared to handle this upward trend?
I think that there's no question that the numbers will rise in the coming weeks. We haven't seen people really adjusting their behavior at all, despite record high case numbers here in Japan. We've had about 15,000 cases nationwide, I think more than 4,000 in Tokyo for the last week. And by international standards, those numbers are quite low, but they're very high for Japan. And there is definitely concern about how the medical system will handle it. We've seen in the last couple of weeks, the government say that they're going to be asking people, well, not asking people, taking people who have moderate cases of the virus and having them quarantine at home instead of in the hospital, because there are concerns about the number of hospital beds that are available to patients. We're still far from the system being overwhelmed, but there is reasonable concern that that could happen, and the government is definitely preparing for that kind of a scenario. Vaccination rates in Japan are still relatively low. I think about 30%, a little over 30% of people are vaccinated today, which is well behind numbers in other countries. Although vaccinations are proceeding at a pretty rapid clip, we have about 1 million plus vaccinations a day. So hopefully by mid-autumn, if the numbers continue at this rate, we'll have a large percent of the population vaccinated, but you know, that gives still the virus plenty of time to spread throughout the population and create some really serious damage. So there is concern about that, and you know, it's too early to say how that's going to play out. I think that Japan has managed to dodge several bullets before. This is the 4th state of emergency in Tokyo, and the previous 3 times the worry is that the medical system was going to be overwhelmed didn't come to pass. But we're dealing with a new variant of the virus now, so all bets are off.
Well, luckily they seem to have avoided the super spreader sort of situation, despite concerns before the Olympics began. And well, now the Olympics are over, of course, and Jim, Korea ranked 16th, and it won 6 golds, 4 silvers, and 10 bronze medals. And of course, we didn't do as well as we'd hoped. But what was some key moments or milestones for Team Korea?
Well, you know, I'm not sure I agree with the assessment that we didn't do as well as we hoped. It depends how you measure it. Yeah, it's true that in terms of medal tally, this was Korea's worst Olympics since 1984 Los Angeles, which is obviously bad news for people who care the most about adding up the number of medals. But statistics really don't tell the whole story at all. And there are serious questions to answer about some of Korea's core sports, shooting and taekwondo in particular. But you know, Korea arrived in Tokyo with a technique that's worked for years of doing very, very well in a few key events, with the occasional outlier medal thrown in for good measure. And we've left Tokyo as a serious contender in a whole range of sports, from swimming and diving to gymnastics, modern pentathlon, climbing, things that we didn't think of as Korean sports before the Olympics. So I think actually looking forward, this has been kind of a year of a transition that's setting Korea up to be a much bigger contender in the future. I mean, there are still big medal highlights, and obviously the biggest one has to be Ansan and the archery team's dominance. Korea won 4 gold medals in 5 archery events, which matches its record in Rio when there were only 4 events. And Ansan became the first archer ever to win 3 gold medals. The increased foothold in the fencing world as well. Korea won 5 medals in fencing, which is similar to how it did in London 2012, but we'd seen that drop off in Rio, and it's very exciting to see that back. You know, Korea's not traditionally one of the world's best fencing nations. It's very much a sort of an old colonialist European sport. So that's very exciting. 2 medals in gymnastics was a huge surprise. We didn't really expect to get any medals in gymnastics, and to see Yo So-jung make history with the first ever Korean woman to win a medal in gymnastics, bronze in the women's vault, was huge. A lot of those firsts, I think, were really exciting. Chunung Tae won bronze in modern pentathlon just 2 days ago. Again, modern pentathlon is not a sport where Korea has ever medaled, and it's such a difficult sport to medal in. There's so many different disciplines involved. So to see Korea medaling in that is not only a sign of Korea's ability in that sport, but of the 5 sports that constitute it as well. Jung Jin-hwa also finished 4th in the same event. Again, that's very, very exciting. And there were the non-medal success stories that are signs of things to come. I mean, obviously, we have Hwang Sun-woo in the swimming pool, breaking every Korean record he could get his hands on. We have Woo Ha-ram going further than any Korean diver has ever gone before and very, very nearly medaling. Woo Sang-hyuk breaking the Korean high jump medals. Ho Chae-an emerging as a serious contender in sport climbing. All of these are sports that are not what we consider Korean sports. And for Korea to now suddenly have people, and these are all young athletes with a future in the sport, means that, you know, the nature of the game is changing, I think, for Korea going forward. We should no longer go to Olympics just expecting taekwondo, shooting, archery, and, you know, maybe the occasional badminton or table tennis medal. We can now expect to be competing in all of these sports, and a lot of these are the big sports that make headlines more than kind of the niche sports that Korea has traditionally contended. I think that those are all very, very exciting. Team sports, less exciting, I think, at this Olympics. We didn't do as well as we'd expected, but obviously the women's volleyball team still shone, so there is still a highlight there. They entered the tournament as pretty much the absolute underdogs, the second lowest ranked team in the whole tournament, and ended up in 4th place and killed a good few giants along the way as well. So I think we've actually had a very positive Olympics.
Right, so a lot of more diversity rather than disappointment, really, and Korea really broadening its presence at the Olympics there. And well, Ben, before we go, well, we tend to remember each Olympics by the name of the host city, and that, of course, that city, of course, becomes the centre of the sporting world during that 2-week period. How do you think the Tokyo Olympics will be remembered, and how will its legacy compare with the 64 Games?
Wow, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, it's going to be impossible to separate the Olympics from the pandemic. And for that reason alone, it's going to stand out, I think, as a unique event in a lot of ways. For Japan, you asked about the 64 Games. I think that the 64 Games happened at a time when the country was rising to, you know, prominence after the end of the Second World War. It was a time of celebration and pride for Japan. And I think that today, looking at Tokyo 2020, there's a sense of kind of national malaise, which is quite different than the feeling that existed in Japan in 1964. There's a sense that Japan is kind of pulling back from the world, and that perhaps it's a nation in decline, relative decline in any case. Whether that's true or not is open to question, but certainly some people feel that way. And I think that domestically, there's a sense that this has revealed a government that is not responsive to people. As I said before, 80% of the people didn't want these games to happen, and they happened anyway. And there's a lot of frustration with the government as well. And I think, on the other hand, internationally, it's an incredible accomplishment that Japan was able to stage its games in one of the worst crises of, you know, certainly our lifetimes. So there is that, and I think that is a positive takeaway from Japan, and perhaps something that, you know, what the legacy of the games will be. It kind of depends, I guess, ultimately on how the pandemic proceeds. This was meant to mark humanity's success over the pandemic, and if things get better, then perhaps this will be seen as exactly that, a symbol of the success. But if they get worse, then I guess we'll see how history remembers it.
Well, for now, the baton's been handed over to France, and well, hopefully by then we will no longer need to worry about this kind of pandemic situation then. Well, that was Ben DOOLEY, Japan correspondent at the New York Times, and BULLEY, senior sports reporter at the Korean JoongAng Daily. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you for watching.